So we had a project that one of our products was specified in on. It was a big industrial project. Somewhere along the line, before the project came back to us to actually procure, someone fat fingered our product SKU and switched one of the letters. And I've also seen other instances where, they dropped a dash and changed one of the numbers, or, just weird things happen sometimes. And no one cares if it takes us more time, and that's fine. But the problem is then we're going back and asking. We can't just send you a quote if we don't know what actual product you're trying to procure. And often a lot of these, as you mentioned, like there's so much work out there to be done. There's such a backlog that they don't even have time in many cases to respond to us to try to figure out from the end user, from the engineer, about, well, what did they mean by this SKU that's not a real SKU? And it's a year and a half into the project, and the engineer signed off 12 months ago and is nowhere to be found now. And so to me, from our vantage, like that's a place where these customers of ours can really save a lot of time and headache of, you know, why is this supplier, chasing me now about something that I don't know. I just need a quote. I don't care what the SKU is. I just need a quote. And I get that, but we can't do our job to help them if the data is not right. So the data integrity is just so important. And, definitely a huge fan of what you guys are doing to try to standardize it all. You brought up tariffs. It's such a big problem. It's a big story, for everyone, even outside of procurement. But I think what we've seen is that the biggest thing people are worried about is not necessarily, was it made in this country versus this country versus USA. Now, there's certainly exceptions, when you're talking about some different government projects where there's no exceptions whatsoever except for American made. But what they're really concerned about at a ground level, working on these projects, is how does it impact my cost? And am I going to get surprised by an additional 50% surcharge because I didn't know where the product was manufactured, and that manufacturer is now going to pass it along at the 11th hour? And that's what's really scary for a lot of the customers.
I think it's just you mentioned, like, fat fingering, and it was a different SKU. It's like, you replace a letter and all of a sudden it changes from domestic to import. I mean, we're talking about like just the most minor details, and it can throw a job completely off course, right? And throw your costs completely off course, which is exactly what we are trying to solve for. And again, I think it comes down to just making sure that that data is traveling and that there's good content behind the scenes. You mentioned it before, like we'll talk to a guy out in the field, a contractor out in the field, and they're ordering materials and they don't care what the SKU is, right? Like they need 1,000 feet of wire on the site by the end of the day. And so they're going to literally just send that to whoever is doing the purchasing. But who's doing the purchasing cares, because they're looking at the specs of the job, and they have to know, what exactly they need to buy, or if it has to be made in America. So they care about the data behind the scenes, but maybe not as much as even the supplier, right? Because when they get it, they have to know what they're stocking, and they actually have to know the SKU so they can communicate with their manufacturer. So you're dealing with all these different personas. And again, the same item traveling throughout the entire job. But if we can build behind it all of the content that's needed by the different personas, right? Maybe your designer or detail needs, the dimensions. Well, then the purchaser doesn't need the dimensions. He needs the SKU and the material. And then, it's all these different people needing different pieces. And if we can just build all of it into one record, and use that on the platform, again, we can give the pieces of information that are important to each person throughout the workflow, all the content that they need at that time. And I think that's where it's really critical. And that's what we're trying to do, is create kind of that golden record